I'm Mike Graham and this is Talk TV. Today we're in conversation with Meg Prangley from the Henry Jackson Society because China has been very much in the news this week. Not for the first time, of course, but for something very unusual. Meg, welcome to In Conversation With on Talk TV.
Thank you.
There's been some very odd things going on in China this week. We've seen the Chinese people doing something perhaps we didn't think they'd ever do, which is rising up against their own government and in fact demanding the resignation of its leader. Tell us what's been going on.
Yes, so important to note that in China, protests actually do happen quite often, but this is novel because it is throughout the international media and throughout the country. So normally protests in China would be quite localized. The biggest topic would normally be on the environment, and now it is an all outright Tiananmen-like, Hong Kong-like protests that we saw a few years back. Except now, as you said, it's calling for the resignation of Xi, which is quite significant, especially given he was just confirmed for the first time ever for his third term of power.
Right.
So we saw this spreading from Shanghai, city to city, and speaking with people that are in China, which is also quite rare because the fact that the Chinese firewall was broken over this, and just that the international media has been able to get in and out, especially with big stories such as the unfortunate news with the BBC journalist that was attacked. This is a unique situation and an opportune time for the West to call out against China. Speaking with people that are in China, they said that over the weekend things were quite crazy, but about 95% of the Chinese people have no idea what's going on and that things have largely returned to status quo today. But that's still within its zero COVID lockdown policy that has now been going on for at least 3 years that we know of.
I was going to say that seems to be what the most of the protests are about, the zero COVID policy. And I listened to a Chinese government official earlier today who was saying that they have no reason not to have a zero COVID policy. And one of the things that people were upset about was the deaths of some Chinese citizens who we haven't had it confirmed, but we think were sort of sealed into their own flats in a building, right?
Yes, and so I was actually living in China in 2019 before the pandemic broke out. And in 2020, it seems, especially just with Westerners that I knew that lived there, China used the zero COVID policy as the ultimate excuse to get rid of all Westerners. So when this happens in 2020, and slowly but surely, especially with the media and journalists, they've been plucking them out of the country. It's very interesting that in Xinjiang, what you're referring to, where it's not necessarily confirmed, but 10 people died and 9 people were injured because of the lockdown. That it's interesting that this is what exploded the protests, because also in Xinjiang what's happening is the millions that are being abused in the Chinese Communist Party's concentration camps. The Chinese people, however, I think, especially from when I lived there, are largely unaware of this. So it makes me wonder, if they only knew what the Chinese Communist Party was doing, what would that outcome look like? So I think that the fact that they're standing in solidarity, they're calling it the white paper movement. So they're holding it up saying that the white paper is representing everything that they can't say, which right now this looks like freedom and not lockdown. But this is a huge opportunity for the people in China, but also within the diaspora, starting here in London. There were protests yesterday at the embassy here in London, at the Chinese embassy. I think that, it's 19 people started this, when if only the Chinese people knew what abuses are happening, who knows what the scale of that would be.
And they had the difficulty, I think, of some stores in China refusing to sell white paper, so they couldn't hold it up anymore. Because I was going to say, with Tiananmen Square, we saw a kind of student movement that led that. Is this a definable movement, do you think, or is it a bit more haphazard than that?
I do think it's more haphazard than Tiananmen. They are saying that it still is largely student-led. So the universities have just started reopening again as of early this morning. However, it is more widespread. And then with that as well, Western governments are responding. So we had Prime Minister Sunak yesterday say that the golden era of UK-Chinese relations is over. That's quite significant. I don't know why we were friends with them to begin with, but I think that this is also a unique opportunity for the UK to step in and call China out for what it's doing, calling China a threat on the international stage, because if the UK doesn't do that and the US continues to have the weak response that they're having, it will only further weaken the West in their eyes. And it also is a company issue. Apple was letting shutting down airdrop within China. Then you have the Chinese companies refusing to sell paper. So this is a time for the government to step in, but more so in the name of freedom.
And as far as the people's safety is concerned, because a lot of people watching the demonstrations were quite amazed at quite how robust they were, because, you know, we've seen things before in China, as you say, notwithstanding Tiananmen Square, but even just during the pandemic before, where they're holding people at sort of arm's length with those weird hooks that they used to put around people, you know, locking people up, you know, putting cameras outside people's doors. I mean, you do worry that the people who are demonstrating, if they're identifiable, they could be in trouble, couldn't they?
Yes, and ironically, the officials in Hong Kong are saying that the protests are potentially harming the people, but the actions of the police themselves are much more harmful. And then they're only reinforcing messages such as the COVID lockdown, walking around the streets wearing hazmat suits. But as far as the people are concerned and their safety, that is not on the mind of the Chinese Communist Party. And then within the last 24 hours, they said that any outbursts, any protests, they want shot down immediately. So I think that China's usual soft authoritarian style of policing, that's very decentralized, is just been turned over a whole notch, just because of the severity of the threat to the party.
Yes. And how bad is the COVID threat there? It doesn't look terrible. I mean, I think they had one case in that particular building where they locked it all down.
Yeah, so as far as the COVID threat, they're saying that in the last, since the weekend, that the COVID cases have risen because of the protests. I think that's common sense.
Right.
After people have been locked up for 3 years. They've kept it well controlled, so I don't think that COVID would be even at the forefront of the mind of what the top issue is in China. So I don't think that's posing a great threat to the Chinese people at all. And I think that the minute the Chinese people rightly are let out of the lockdown, it's going to naturally happen.
Yeah.
So that's almost another line that they're using just as propaganda to continue the lockdown and reinforce what they're already
doing. So
doing.
you think this goes for a while? Is the demonstrations over for now?
I think right now the demonstrations are settling, but I think that the West has to refuse to let this be the end, especially honestly right now with the World Cup. I know that China is not in the World Cup, but they've invested $1.4 billion, which is $0.3 billion more than America. And the two largest sponsors of the World Cup, Vivo and Wanda Group, and those are only two of the four Chinese sponsors. Basically, they're running the international stage right now. The same company that was previously connected to the company that built the concentration camps in Xinjiang built the Lusail Stadium that the World Cup's being played in. So China's hand is over that economically. It's over its people physically. And if the West doesn't stand out against that, this could be a huge lost opportunity, not only for what we saw, let's say, happen in Hong Kong a couple years ago, but this is the whole nation. And if we don't do something now with this, the next signal that she sends is dealing with Taiwan. And so even with the white paper movement, I think that there's a unique, huge opportunity at the World Cup to just use that and standing in global solidarity with China. As far as the protests, I think that they are settling a bit now, and I think what we're going to see over the next few days are going to be, let's say, the worst of the worst, especially the party saying crackdown against the extremists. I think that's what we're going to see, but the pictures that are coming out of China are gruesome. So
they certainly are.
Yeah.
Well, Meg, thanks very much for giving us that insight. That's Meg Prangley there from the Henry Jackson Society, and we'll have more for you next week in conversation with me, Mike Graham, at Talk TV.